Today we begin a study in the book of Esther. Now the book of Esther is one of my favorite books in the Bible pertaining to the providence of God. So this afternoon we'll look at this, we'll introduce this book, and then we'll get into the text of it starting next week. Chronologically, the book of Esther is between Ezra chapters 6 and 7. Where we have about a 58-year period. But the events in the book of Esther only deal with a 20-year period beginning around 483 BC. So these events happened between the first return of the Jews with Zerubbabel and the second return of the Jews with Ezra. The name Esther means star, and her Hebrew name Hadassah, which means myrtle, which is the name of a tree that religiously symbolizes peace and joy. And this fits perfectly with what Esther did for her people. There are only two books in the Bible that are named after a woman. The first is Ruth, and the second is the book of Esther. The author is unknown, but some believe that either Ezra or Mordecai may have written it. This book has been described as an island because it doesn't refer to the law of Moses, and none of the other books in the Bible quote this book. The book of Esther mainly deals with the history of the Jews who didn't return back to Jerusalem because they chose to stay in Persia. Now, while God isn't specifically mentioned in this book, when you read it, you can see God's providence at work so that His people and the bloodline of Christ would be preserved. So there is a twofold purpose of this book. First, it's designed to give us an accurate account of what happened to these Jews in Persia during this time, and to show how the Jewish race was preserved by the bravery of Esther and by the providence of God. Second, it gives us the history behind the Feast of Purim, which is still observed by Jews today. The key words of this book are providence and protection. The key verses, two key verses in this book begin with Esther chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. Where Mordecai writes to Esther and says, if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink 3 days, nor night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Esther 8 and 17 is another key verse. And in every province and city, wherever the king's command and the decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. And the key phrase for this entire book is for such a time as this. Now the key chapter is chapter 11, because this chapter records how the Jews were saved from the decree the king made against the Jews due to Haman's evil plot, and how Esther went to the king and brought about another decree so that the Jews could defend themselves. It also recaps how Haman was hung on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. If Esther hadn't been brave and went before the king, then countless Jews would have been killed. Her bravery brought joy and honor to the Jews, and God's providence is what made it all happen. Even though this book doesn't mention God, it's easy to see God at work in these events. Matthew Henry wrote, if the name of God is not here, His finger is. Now I want you to notice a quote by J. Baxter. and what he had to say about this. He said if God had been specifically mentioned in the story, or still more, if the story had been specifically explained in so many words that it was God who was bringing about all those happenings which are recorded, the dramatic force and moral impact of the story would have been reduced. For above all, we are meant to see in the natural outworking of events how, without violating human free will and without interrupting ordinary ongoing human affairs, a hidden power, unsuspectedly but infallibly controls all things. Now folks, this is true today. While many events happen in our lifetime without God being mentioned, as Christians we can know that God has a part in what happens. And how does he have that part? Well, he has it through his providence. After all, he has the power to build and to destroy nations, as Job said in Job 12 and 23. He makes nations great, and he destroys them. He enlarges nations and guides them. Well, next I want to look at some of the principal characters of this book. And the first is King Ahasuerus, which most agree that this is referring to King Xerxes I, who reigned from 485 to 464 BC. Historically, this was a man who was morally bankrupt and who would change his mind over and over again. Baxter gives us some great insight into this man's character. He says this is the king who ordered a bridge to be built over Hellespont, who on learning that the bridge had been destroyed by a tempest just after its completion, was so blindly enraged that he commanded 300 strokes of the surge be inflicted on the sea, and then the unhappy builders of the bridge beheaded. This is the king on whom being offered a sum equivalent to 5.5 million sterling by Pythias the Lydian toward the expenses of a military expedition, was so enraptured of such loyalty that he returned the money, accompanied by a handsome present. And then, on being requested by this same Pythias shortly afterwards to spare him just one of his sons, the eldest, from the expedition as a sole support for his declining years, furiously ordered that son to be cut into 2 pieces and the army to march between them. This is the king who dishonored the remains of the heroic Spartan Leonidas. This is the king who drowned in the humiliation of his inglorious defeat in such a plunge of sensuality that he publicly offered a prize for the invention of some new indulgence. Herodias tells us that among the myriads that gathered for the expeditions against Greece, Ahasuerus was the fairest in personal beauty and stately bearing, but morally he was a mixture of passionate extremes. He is the despot to dethrone Queen Vashti for refusing to expose herself before his drunk friends. He's just the one to consign a people like the Jews to be massacred and then swing over to the opposite extreme of sanctioning Jewish vengeance on thousands of his other subjects. Now, knowing this background information about this king helps us better understand his actions in the book of Esther. Vashti was the queen of Ahasuerus. He loved to have feast and offer up wine for his guests to drink. And at the end of a 7-day feast, he wanted his wife to come before the men he was entertaining so that they could see how beautiful she was. But she refused the king. Her actions that day were very commendable, but it did cost her her crown, and it opened up a door for a new queen to be sought. Now, folks, we should admire and respect Vashti's decision. She wasn't willing to show herself an object of lust to a group of drunken men, even if it meant that she would lose her crown. There are many women today that need to learn a great lesson about immodesty, because many take no thought in how they dress or what they expose. And some even dress themselves as skimpy as they can so that they can get attention, or they can use their bodies as a way of advancing themselves in the workplace. No one named a Christian should ever do this, because Paul teaches us that women and men should dress in such a way that will profess godliness. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 through 10. Mordecai is an interesting man. He was probably born while in Babylonian captivity. When Mordecai's uncle died, he adopted his daughter as his own because she had no one else that could take care of her. Mordecai did his best to raise Esther and give her guidance. And when she was chosen to be one of the women to whom the king would choose his new queen from, he advised her not to tell anyone that she was a Jew. And while he was hanging out at the king's gate to find out if Esther would be chosen or not, he heard the plan of 2 eunuchs who were going to kill the king. And he let the king know about this. And since Mordecai exposed these traitors, his name and what he did was written in the Royal Chronicles of Persia, Esther 2 and 23. Later on, he would even be honored by the king for his good deed. And even though it's not specifically stated, I believe that Mordecai showed his loyalty to God by not bowing down to Haman, who at this time was the official second to the king. According to Greek history, when a Persian would go before the king, they paid homage to him as a god. And even though Haman was not the king himself, Mordecai wasn't about to bow down to a man and give him the homage that belonged to God. Mordecai also played a significant role in the providence of God because he encouraged Queen Esther to speak up to the king so that the Jewish people might be able to survive the wicked plot of Haman. And as the story goes, we know that Mordecai ends up taking the position of Haman while Haman is hung on the same gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Esther was a beautiful Hebrew woman. And as I said earlier, she was raised by her cousin Mordecai. And out of all the young virgins in Persia, Esther won the heart of the king and became the new queen. And even though Haman managed to get the king to sign a decree to kill the Jews in their area, Esther dug down deep. And she went before the king and she revealed the reason for Haman's plan. And that she was a Jew herself. Her bravery saved her people, which shows how much of a difference just one person can make. Now finally, we need to talk about Haman. Haman was the prime minister of the king. And folks, he was rotten to the core. All he thought about was himself and his reputation. He's called an Agagite. And this means that he was an Amorite. And he was most likely a direct descendant of King Agag, who Saul was supposed to kill but didn't. We can see how prideful he was because he just couldn't stand it when Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. And this is why he plotted not only to take down Mordecai, but all the Jews. Haman was successful at getting the king to sign a decree that the Jews should be destroyed. But folks, everything else he kept trying to do kept going wrong for him. For instance, he was going to the king to hang, he was going to get the king to hang Mordecai. But instead, he ended up having to parade him around for exposing the plot of the eunuchs to kill the king. The gallows he made to hang Mordecai on ended up being used to hang him. This goes to show you that it doesn't pay to be evil. And even if you get your way all of your life, By living the evil way, eventually you're going to pay for your evil deeds when you stand before God at the judgment day. The book of Esther centers around 3 different feasts. The first is the Feast of Ahasuerus, chapters 1 and 2. And in that feast, the following things happen. The king has a feast for 180 days for the princes, officials, and servants. And then he has a 7-day feast for all the people in Shushan. Queen Vashti refuses to parade herself before these drunken men. Esther is chosen queen, and she becomes the new queen. Mordecai saves the life of the king. The second feast is the Feast of Esther, and it covers the events leading up to the feast and its outcome in chapters 3 through 7. The following events happened here. Number 1, the king promotes Haman as his ambassador, and Mordecai refuses to bow down to him. Secondly, Haman gets the king to sign a decree to destroy all the Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar, which is the later part of our February and the beginning of our March. The next thing, the Jews mourn when they hear about this. And then Mordecai encourages Esther to go before the king, and she does. Esther invites the king and Haman to her feast. Haman plots to hang Mordecai, but the king honors him, and Haman has to participate. At Esther's banquet, she revealed Haman's plot to kill her people, and Haman gets hung on his own gallows that he built for Mordecai. The third feast is the Feast of Purim, and it covers the events that bring this feast to life in chapters 8 through 10. The following events happen there. First, the king honors Esther and Mordecai. Then, at Esther's request, the king authorizes the Jews to defend themselves when the Persians came to kill her. And when the day came that the Jews killed more than 75,000 of their enemies, including the 10 sons of Haman. The Feast of Purim is instituted. The exhortation of Mordecai is given. Now I want to give you just a little bit more information about the Feast of Purim, which was instituted by Mordecai in Esther 9, verse 20. Here's what the Nelson Bible Dictionary states about this. It says, this feast commemorates the delivery of the Jewish people from destruction by an evil schemer named Haman during the days of their captivity by the Persians. It took its name from the Babylonian word put, meaning lot, because Haman cast lots to determine when he would carry out his plot against the Jews. The Feast of Purim took place on the 14th and 15th of Adar, and during its celebration, the book of Esther is read as a reminder of their deliverance, a happy ceremony. Purim is accompanied with the giving of gifts and much celebration. Now, the last thing I want to look at this afternoon is some of the great lessons that we can learn from this book, from the book of Esther. The first being, this book teaches us how God is watching out for us. He's working in the background. We just have to have faith that He's doing so. As Paul said in Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work together for good to those that love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. The second thing we learn is and it's because Queen Vashti gives us a great example to all women. That they don't have to compromise with the world and parade themselves around so that they can appease the lustful eye of worldly men. And folks, of course, men can learn this same lesson. And number 3, finally, this book teaches us the importance of always being ready to serve God like Mordecai and Esther did. Sometimes we may have to make a hard choice like Esther did, but we must be willing to do it. When we know it will bring honor and glory to our God, this is why Paul tells us to be ready. Be ready for every good work. In Titus 3, verse 1. The Lord's invitation is extended at this time as together we stand and sing.